We'd like to thank Cloud Foundry, our sponsor, for these podcasts from Cloud Foundry Summit in Frankfurt, Germany. Cloud Foundry gives companies the speed, simplicity, and control they need to develop and deploy applications faster and easier. It's open source, easy to iterate, and built to scale. Learn more at cloudfoundry.org. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here in the final session of the Cloud Foundry Summit in Frankfurt, here with Duncan Johnston-Watt of Cloudsoft, Ian Andrews of Pivotal, and Brian Gallagher of EMC Dell, or Dell EMC.
Dell EMC.
That's right. I was reading your.
Is it backwards?
No, I was probably getting it wrong somehow. So here we are in Frankfurt, and Cloud Foundry has grown just tremendously over the past year, really. I mean, it really has taken off. I mean, you compare this to the Santa Clara conference last May, and it just seems larger in scope now, right? You know, and you guys are seeing you coming out with new announcements every day related to Cloud Foundry. I guess my first question is, you know, how are customers keeping up, you know, with all this? I mean, we talked about this at LinuxCon about the tyranny of choice. You know, there's like this, you know, how are you helping them keep their heads straight? I mean, Duncan, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a big question. I think I would put it a different way, which is, there's a lot happening, but I think while some of it is around the core, a lot of it is now in the ecosystem surrounding Cloud Foundry. So what I've noticed is, so I was here for the special interest groups. There's a lot of interest now from users, from the ISV community, as well as obviously from the core service providers. So I'd say it's breadth that's really what I've seen evolve over the last period of time.
How do you guys think about that and managing that for your own customers, especially when you're thinking about, you know, microservices environments, right? You know, and how they use microservices, and they do have tremendous choice. Is that where opinionated environments are very helpful for them?
Yeah, I'd just start off by saying there's too many choices, and what we see in our customer base is they're trying to vet through all the different alternatives that are out there, and it's challenging. I think there's a lot of new technologies that pop up every day. There's new things that come to the market, and in a way, it's very daunting to go through those choices. But what we found is that where containers have gotten a lot of momentum since the beginning of 2014. The fact of the matter is there's still a lot of applications that are built upon virtual machines and will continue to be so. And when we look at platforms, there's a lot of metrics and decision points that go into the proper choice of a platform. Whether it supports containers and virtual machines, whether it's open source or closed source, what types of language support are out there, what kind of deployment models that are out there. And when you take a good hard look at all the choices that are out there, Cloud Foundry stands head and shoulders above many of the alternatives that are there. The other alternatives are very good at what they do, but they're not as comprehensive of a platform as Cloud Foundry is.
So that comprehensiveness of the platform itself, and how do you think about evolving a platform that is so comprehensive? I mean, you have a customers trying to get their heads around microservices, for example. Now, how do you kind of like marry that breadth of what Cloud Foundry offers with this need for customers to develop microservices they can scale across millions of people?
So, couple comments, Alex, on that topic. So, one, at Pivotal, we're investing pretty heavily in a large evangelism team because we're very much in the early end of the market, right? We're teaching our customers how to swim before they get to the deep end and drown in a lot of ways. I think if you look at where those organizations are, the thing that's driving them down this path to look at microservices. Is that the doomsday clock? What just happened there?
That's the call.
That's it.
I guess we're done.
Podcast is now official.
So I think
I feel like we're on the Gong Show or something like that.
Stay tuned for
watch out for somebody with a pie or something running out of the. I think the interesting thing that's happening right now is you're seeing a big shift from enterprises that were set up to buy software and configure it to building their own software, right? So being good at software development is becoming a critical path. I think that's one of the underlying forces driving this shift in platform tech, is because you're now saying my operational capability has to keep up with my development organization. And understanding that you can't do microservices in isolation from a different operational model, DevOps. You can't do that in isolation from a different platform architecture, and helping customers see these are all sort of sides of the same object is really the first step in figuring out this brave new world that we're entering. And I think once you get them there, the pieces start to come together, right? So Cloud Foundry enables you to deploy and operate microservices at scale. Right? Most large enterprises struggle with operating their systems at any sort of reasonable service availability level. So introducing something like Cloud Foundry isn't increasing the complexity, it's actually decreasing the complexity, raising availability, actually enables them to reasonably do things like continuous delivery, which most organizations today, that's a dream, like a desired future state, rather than something they've been practicing for years. So while I think there is complexity in Cloud Foundry, right? It does a lot of things, very powerful. Compared to the complexity that we're resolving, it's actually something that's very consumable.
How does that play for you, Duncan, in like this idea of the multi-cloud? I think one of the powers of your platform is that capability, right?
Sure. So I think what's interesting as I think Cloud Foundry has become more widely adopted is, to begin with, I think it was adopted by the cool kids, so seriously. But as it gets deeper into enterprise and people start to be more serious about what they want to build with it, then what we're seeing is the need to actually tie it back into the existing enterprise world. And so, I'm banging my own drum, of course, but the idea that you can reach back and actually, in a very principled way, pull through existing data sets into the world of Cloud Foundry is one of the things that we're seeing huge demand for. And why? Because then you're building these new world apps, but you're also able to leverage the existing data.
Exactly.
And for a financial services company, to take one example, the sort of data we're talking about isn't going to be just routinely copied into another database that happens to sit inside of the brave new world. You'll want to have a very controlled way of accessing that. And so the operational controls, this is what I tend to focus on these days, the operational controls that come with Cloud Foundry are almost as important as the end user experience.
Yep.
You need both.
No, I completely agree. I think if you compare Cloud Foundry to something like Kubernetes, a handful of major differences that go to exactly to your point, like tenancy, right? How do I support multiple groups, different security requirements, access controls on the same platform? Like Cloud Foundry, hands down, it doesn't exist in the world of Kubernetes. I think the integration of operating system, and then where we actually take the concern about building and maintaining the operating system entirely off the table for the Cloud Foundry layer. Radical simplification for organizations that typically have a run book that looks like this to page through to build an OS. And then I think the third thing is really the service broker model, which is where our products integrate. And you're actually even seeing the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, right, look to bring that into the world of Kubernetes, because the point you made hit the nail on the head, right? For large organizations, there is no model where everything that they've got in the existing portfolio goes to cloud tomorrow, right? It's a long tail transition. People jokingly talk about strangling the monolith. Well, the monolith is going to be a zombie that just won't die, right? I mean, there's going to be stuff running in the enterprise for a long time, and I think the interface between the new architecture and the old architecture is going to be a critical one to maintain.
And you want to pick the applications and services that are going to deliver the most value to your business, and so you're not simply going to rework things for the sake of it.
Yeah, not at all.
So I think that's an important consideration.
Now, my guidance to customers when they ask me that question, because that's always okay, I get it, Cloud Foundry's cool, it makes a ton of sense to me, I see everybody else is doing it, where do I start? And I think there's kind of a three-way matrix that you can look at in your organization in order to evaluate applications, right? One is obviously technical suitability, right? If you wrote something in COBOL running on a mainframe, like that's going to be a heavy lift to bring that forward to Cloud Foundry. But it's not purely technical fit. I think it's business criticality, right? Is this a system that drives every customer interaction that you have? Or is this a system that one analyst in the back office touches that no one really cares about? And then the third thing is just the velocity of change for that app. Do you have a huge backlog of work planned for it, or is it relatively static? And I think if you take those three criteria and stripe them across the existing portfolio, it gives you a roadmap to say, the ones that score highly across all three categories, that's where I start. And I have the most immediate impact to the organization. I reduce the operational burden, and I drive the greatest developer productivity improvement, which gives me a throughput to pay down further technical debt.
And I think, Brian, when we were talking just before the podcast started, you were saying that systems of engagement are really much more to the fore now, and that's oftentimes where people start, right? So
we see a lot of that where dealing with systems of records and the data gravity that's associated with those systems of records, it tends to be a challenge in getting access to production data, from the development teams. Methodologies of copy services can be deployed to, kind of open up that access to data and the various data services that the system of record has. But in many cases, you can engage customers much easier in a system of engagement, right? So having that direct, immediate feedback, applying the principles of build, measure, learn, and iterate, and the ability to pivot or persist based on that engagement. And I think that's critical. And back to the platform facilitates a lot of the developer workflows in terms of how modern software is built, how it's deployed, how it's operated. And just getting back to what you guys were talking about earlier, the operations management capabilities of the platform are what attracted me to this technology area. Things that IT operators have had to deal with for decades, a lot of those headaches are taken away by the infrastructure automation and the capabilities that are built into the platform itself. And it allows the developer to go back and develop instead of support. In many cases, developers spend more time supporting an app than they do burning down the feature or backlog. And that's the whole thing about shorten that cycle of innovation. The less time you can spend on the operations, the deployment, the operational support, the versioning, the maintaining, the debugging, all that associated with it, the more innovation you can get in that time period.
So what does that say, Brian, then about the evolution of platforms themselves and the direction of platforms overall?
Yeah, I think the benefit, that we see and the evolution that we see in platforms is the abstraction level, right? And the more complex things are, the harder it is to get it right and to be able to, support it, maintain it, and operate it. So the abstraction levels that the platform provides allow this detachment. Developers don't necessarily need to know what's underlying, as long as they know that it's going to their target cloud. And I think that, that aspect kind of frees up that traditional app dev cycle where, the platform, the operating system, all the the physical characteristics of the platform were important. Now they're abstracted. But then the platform capabilities are starting to evolve to provide more control. So with abstraction, you lose control, but you need to be able to provide the necessary automation within the platform to maintain that control over what's important to the business. The SLA, the governance, risk, and compliance, all the attributes that the business is looking for that application to serve its users.
It's interesting to think this through a little bit when you think about all those levels of abstraction and the varying workloads now that are being that the users are pushing out onto infrastructure, right? You have container-based workloads, you have just traditional workloads, which then brings up lots of questions about schedulers and orchestration environments. And I'm just curious on, Kubernetes is known for their scheduler environment. Mesos has its own form of schedulers, right? In the Cloud Foundry world, I'm curious about that evolution of schedulers and orchestrators for those kind of different types of workloads, so the system can automatically understand what the workloads are that they need. For instance, different priority, different different capacity. Yeah.
Undoubtedly, I mean, it's something that we're seeing come up. Because the thing about platforms now is it's software all the way down, so everything underneath is commoditized. So at this point, the full stack, whether you're running the app or whether you're actually the platform, it's all software. I mean, and so one of the things that I think is interesting, and it's an area that certainly we're keen to explore, is where can Cloud Foundry take advantage of other advancements? So not just playing nice in terms of working with the CNCF around the service broker, which I think is very, very important, but is there stuff that we could sort of delegate to them in some areas? So I'm thinking, and this is really your department, Ian, but there are proposals kicking around.
See where you're going.
Well, I'm thinking of things like the container networking proposal. That's a pretty radical proposal to try and fit into, I would say, the current Cloud Foundry model, versus seeing if there are ways of leveraging things like Kubernetes under the hood. Now that is, certainly being thought through and discussed. Whether it comes to pass or not, who knows?
Yeah, so we're already going down the path of implementing, in the most recent Cloud Foundry release, pivotal Cloud Foundry release, added TCP routing. Mm-hmm. The next logical step is multi-port on the containers, and that basically gets us to container networking, right? In terms of the question that Alex asked, so I wouldn't think about containers as a workload, right? The container is just a container. The workloads haven't necessarily changed radically, right? Today, most people in the container layer are primarily deploying app servers, JVMs, and your application code. Particularly if we talk about things that are being done in anger versus kind of prototype or on a developer workstation.
The so-called DIY paths, I guess.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, even in the Cloud Foundry context. Like, Cloud Foundry has been built on containers since the beginning, right? So when I say container, I'm not sort of speaking synonymously of the Docker Kubernetes stack. I'm just saying generically, the container workload du jour is kind of it's app runtime for the most part. And so I think the evolution of the platform has been, well, how can we take what used to be Tomcat servlet container running on a VM that was built via an admin clicking around in vSphere and wiring up disks and network, how can we take that to a level of automation that's radically more efficient and more resilient and allows for constant change, right? So that's been the evolution that's happened over the last 10 years, is we've gone from an IT doctrine that's basically said, don't ever change anything ever, because when you touch it, it breaks, right? That's ITIL. Like if anybody wanted to go to an ITIL training course, I just summed it up for you. You don't need to go anymore. Don't ever change anything ever.
The Department of No.
Exactly. I mean, the entire process doctrine that IT has subscribed to for 2 decades has been, we're going to establish a barrier to change so high that people will give up before they summit the mountain, right? And so you've seen, a lot of our customers articulate, 90-day release cycles. So they do 4 a year. To a point where customers are now saying, no, I want to do continuous delivery. Right, and this is not startups, this is big banks. I was in Canada a couple months ago with one of the top 5 banks in that country, and they said, look, today it takes us 10 weeks to go from code complete to production. Our goal is to get to same week delivery. So 5 days, we're done on Monday, we ship on Friday. I said, great, how do you get there? No answer, literally no plan. They're like, we think there might be something to do with Docker in here. There might be some DevOps, but we're not really sure. And I said, well, walk me through what your deployment pipeline looks like today. And the ops guy sitting in the corner goes, well, 10% of my organization has to shepherd code from environment to environment to environment, because every environment's different. Every time we move environments, things break because we're doing a lot of script-based, configuration contained with code. What I think if you ask any reasonably good software architect is generally bad practice, they're doing all of that. And so the platform evolution that's happened right now is really about gutting that part of these large technology bureaucracies that exist in big organizations, allowing them to go from code complete to prod as quickly as possible. And so I think a lot of people are getting wrapped up about, I've got to be able to schedule containers. It doesn't really matter. It's the thing inside the container. If you look at Cloud Foundry, we're going to release benchmarks here in a couple weeks. It'll be thousands of containers. Kubernetes does thousands of containers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. It's all ultimately equivalent.
Workloads is irrelevant then? I mean, it hasn't changed at all in your view?
Well, if supported scale is infinite, right? Do you need to have QoS to prioritize one workload over the other? Right? If we've got effectively unlimited infrastructure running on public cloud, and we've got the ability to spin things up and tear them down almost immediately, right? Is the priority to workload balance such a necessity?
How do you then play in issues such as compliance and security then into that? I mean, and you're seeing the evolution of these data pipelines really, where you're needing to have a better kind of inherent understanding of what is going into that, what is on the network, what is actually being run, and it has to be done automatically to some extent too.
I think platforms generally make that problem much easier to solve for 2 reasons, right? As you get consistency at layers in the stack, as opposed to being hand-tooled by people, you have much more understanding of what's running. Right, which is sort of problem number 1 in security. I don't know what's deployed where. I don't know how it's configured. I don't know if it was correctly configured or incorrectly configured. And I've got lots of variants. So you look at, Cloud Foundry embeds an operating system that nobody logs in to configure, right? When there's a CVE in Linux, we turn that back around to our customers in 48 hours. And then the platform is able to update all those environments without taking downtime, which is a remarkably different way than how most people do things like patch management today, where it takes weeks to months. And we actually do that all the way up the stack, right? We do that in the same fashion with our middleware layer, what's called build packs in Cloud Foundry. Same level of maintenance support and ability to update with zero downtime, which fundamentally changes the model around security, where I think a lot of the vulnerabilities, breaches, advanced persistent threat are actually because customers are unable to update their infrastructure. It's not a zero-day attack, it's a well-known vulnerability being exploited in many cases that's simply gone unpatched.
Brian, any thoughts before we conclude on the evolution of platforms in your view?
Yeah, so we talked about container scheduling. Clearly there's opportunities within the platform to apply, advanced automation in the scheduling process and things like continuous workload placement and optimization. So the platform over the past, I'd say, couple years has evolved to allow for more pluggability. Right, so pluggability above, pluggability below. In fact, we worked in conjunction with IBM and Pivotal on the persistence project to allow for persistence layer accessible to the developer in Cloud Foundry. So instead of using network protocols to get to a service, a data service, you can use your normal file system semantics, and not have to rewrite certain applications if those applications leverage a distributed file system. And as we look at scaling the ecosystem, there's a lot of contributors and requests that are coming in daily into the ecosystem. One of the objectives of the Cloud Foundry Foundation is to increase the amount of committers through expanding dojos across the globe. We opened one in Cambridge earlier this year. There's other, like HP is opening one.
SAP's opened one.
SAP's opening one here locally. And what you'll see with that is, additional innovations that come into the platform itself and through the pluggability of the platform. One last thing I'll say is that the rigor that goes into the development of the platform itself is by far the best that I've seen in my career, and I've worked most of that career in mission critical systems. And the methodology that is used and the scale testing that's deployed, in a build, of a release of Cloud Foundry is just outstanding. And obviously as you start to throw in more, variations of schedulers or platforms or IaaS providers, that increases the scale, but the community is committed to supporting that model and to be able to test and deploy at scale. So I believe over the next several years you'll see more and more innovations within the platform itself.
Duncan?
I'll just add to that I think it's a very kind of broad church now, and it's great to see Google here. Yeah. So I'm not just here sponsoring and talking about what they're doing and making Cloud Foundry available. And again, back to this earlier comment I made about expanding the reach and the ecosystem, they're doing it with their own data services and saying you can hook directly into those. That's as important if you're in the cloudy world as it is to hook back into the enterprise data if you're from a more traditional environment.
Right.
So I think I see a lot of very positive signs emerging. There's a high bar, sure, to being a committer and being involved, but I think why lower the bar? But what happens, right? But getting more people involved, I think, and certainly on our side, it will be encouraging the guys to create a stronger, richer core, and for us to then leverage, things like the Service Broker API. That I think is going to, help broaden the appeal of this platform.
Well, guys, thank you very much for taking some time to talk here at the Cloud Foundry Summit in Frankfurt. Look forward to following up with you all soon.
Thank you.
Great, thank you.
We'd like to thank Cloud Foundry, our sponsor for these podcasts from Cloud Foundry Summit in Frankfurt, Germany. Cloud Foundry gives companies the speed, simplicity, and control they need to develop and deploy applications faster and easier. It's open source, easy to iterate, and built to scale. Learn more at cloudfoundry.org.